All right. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our show entitled It's Good to Know. So, before anything else, please permit me to introduce myself. I'm Kimi Antonio, a freshman in Ateneo de Manila University, majoring in Communications Technology Management, a devoted musician, an aspiring artist, and most important of all, a registered voter, and your wonderful host for this webinar. Now, what is this It's Good to Know webinar we're having? Well, the Parish Pastoral Council for Responsible Voting, or PPCRV as we are all familiar with them, is having this webinar as part of their initial voters education efforts. But what's interesting about this webinar is that it's a three-part technical series. So the presentations, the questions, and the discussions we'll have are all going to be focused on the technical aspect of our elections. Last week, we had the topic, what is a VCM or vote counting machine with Tito Henry Aguda. And for this part two, our topic will be about how does transmission of votes happen. But before I introduce our speaker for this afternoon, let's just quickly have another getting to know you session. So there will be some questions will flash and kindly put in your answers quickly. For those following us via live stream on Facebook, feel free to write in your answers in the comment section. So, for our first question of today, all right. So, for our first question of today, it asks, how old are you? Now, there are a few options here. Wait lang po ha, I'm not seeing the poll. Baka may some technical difficulties po tayo. Ayun, there is the question. So, please feel free to put in your answers in the given poll presented on your screens. So, the first question is, what is your age? Are you 25 years old and below, the Gen Zs of the nation? 26 to 39 years old, millennials? 40 to 59 years old, the great titos and titas of our country, or 60 years old and above, the great lolos and lolas of our country. So please feel free to put in your answers in the given survey presented on your screen. All right. So with that, our next question is, are you a registered voter? No? Elections are coming up next year and it'll be really good to vote in this coming election. So is it a yes or no question? All right. So our last question is, how tech connected of a person are you? Know, like what social medias do you normally use on a basis? Now you can select as much options as you want. So there's Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, which is my personal favorite, Kumu, Laika, Discord, or others. So please feel free to answer as much choices as you want. We'll give you guys some time to answer. All right, so I guess that concludes our poll, and we actually have our survey results from these questions presented. So uh, let us wait for the results as they come to us. All right. So it's actually good to know that majority of our audience are age 40 to 59 years old. Our great titos and titas, no? And it's also really good to know that 94% of you are registered voters. So to that little 6%, no, that little small margin of our audience, please feel free to vote as soon as possible. And it's actually that our most commonly used social medias is actually Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and Kumu, with the bottom being actually Discord and others. Well, there is some people using Discord. Now, if you don't know what Discord is, it's a very popular voice channel app that many people in my generation use. So I guess that concludes our getting to know you session. Now it's good to get a glimpse of who our audience is. So later on, as we are listening to the presentation, please feel free to write your comments in our Zoom chat box. Or for those following us via live stream, write your questions in the comment section. We'll try to answer as much as we could during our Q&A portion. And now, let me get on with introducing our strong speaker for this afternoon. So one, he is a strong proponent of information technology. He's currently the Chief Technology Officer at MDI Novare, working on digital transformation, elastic infrastructure, and end-to-end agile DevOps. He is a strong advocate of internet and technology civil society, very much involved with the Internet Society, the Asia Foundation, and PH CERT. He is a strong champion of providing quality IT education. He teaches in Ateneo de Manila University, my home and my alma mater, and various other academic institutions. He is a strong supporter of clean, honest, accurate, meaningful, and peaceful elections, being a member of the Board of Trustees and co-IT director of PPCRV. So again, please join me in welcoming the strong CTO ng bayan, Dr. William Yu.
Right, so thank you very much for the introduction, Kimi. And now I'm going to start my presentation. So presentation today is basically how does transmission of votes happen in an automated election system, right? So let's start. First, I'd like to start out with a few transmission statistics. Then I'll explain how transmission is done, the various modes of transmission, and who the transmissions are sent to. And we'll cover a few frequently asked questions as well. So let's get started. Right. So first off, let's look at some transmission statistics, right? So first off, this is some election statistics. How much data are we really talking about? So in 2010, we have around 51 million voters. In 2013, we had around 52 million voters. 2016, 54. 2019, 63. And we're expecting roughly the same number of voters for 2020, about 60 to 65 million voters, right? So at that range. In terms of clustered precincts, you would see that in the last 2019 elections, we had 87,540 clustered precincts. And you will see here some statistics in terms of voting centers. These are the physical locations on where these clustered precincts are located. These are your public schools or gyms that are used for elections. There would be around 36,807 of them. And of course, as I'd like to say in my previous presentations, we will unemploy 18,072 people in May of 2022, and we will appoint new 18,072 people in that election. Sorry, it's a presidential election, so probably a little more than that. Okay. In terms of voter turnout, our voter turnout is quite high. It is generally in the range per region between 73 and 85% for the on facility voting. So those who vote present. So this is the national and local elections. But at the same time, you will notice that the turnout rate for the overseas absentee voting, this is the OAV, is generally lower. So this is a area for improvement, I believe, in terms of elections. So this translates at our 63 million registered voters. That will translate to anywhere between 46 to 47 million voters. So that is a lot of votes that would be counted and transmitted during election day. Right? This is the transmission statistics. You will see each line will have different years. So this is basically the first automated election in 2010. So this is the hours. So this is the number of hours since the close of voting. So if you notice, we started off a bit slow in 2010, and it picked up towards at the 5 hours after the election point. It picks up again at the 10 hours after the election point. We're practically done in 20 hours. So within 24 hours, you probably already know the results. In 2013, it basically flattened out a bit. We got off to a good start, but it basically tapered off at the around 70% mark. Then in 2016, we actually transmitted faster. If you notice, the curve is a lot steeper. And in 2019, we transmitted faster as well. So by 2019, we practically know who's going to win on the major contest 10 hours after the election. And we have a good idea already about that. Over 75% of the precincts have transmitted after 5 hours after closing. So things are getting faster and faster in terms of transmission for our automated election systems. This is the statistics for the first 24 hours, right? So how do we actually transmit? How votes are actually transmitted? So first off, the votes themselves are not actually transmitted, but something called an electronic election return, or an ER. The electronic election return is sent to is basically a count or a summary count for that particular clustered precincts of those contests and candidates and the votes that they got. So for example, in the screenshot in the middle, you will see a sample of a printed out electronic returns. This is what we call a manual election return. And you will see here the clustered precinct details. You will see the contest, in this case, president, and you will see the candidates for president and the votes they got for that particular clustered precinct. Now, you can think of the electronic election return as a digital version of this paper-based return, right? The electronic election return is basically a consolidation, or it is basically a accumulation of votes obtained by each candidate. It is sent to 3 major destinations. One is the Municipal Board of Canvassers, or the MBOC. And another copy is sent to something called a central server, which is also the server that will display the public results for the elections, the ones that we can access from the COMELEC public access website. And the third electronic transmission is sent to something called a transparency server. This is the server where the PPCRV, including its partners such as the KDP, the political parties, and other media entities, would get a copy of the election return. Now, there is also something called a manual election return, which is this piece of paper to the right, which is basically a printed out returns. Now, depending on the rules with respect to the elections, we at the PPCRV would obtain one of the first 8 what we call pre-transmission copies. So after an election closes, as Tito Henry explained in the last session, we will actually be printing electronic returns. Now, 8 returns are generally printed out before transmission is done. So these are what we call pre-transmission copies. And what happens then is that one of these 8 copies is sent to PPCRV. And next week, my co-IT director and trustee, Romel Bernardo, will explain actually what we do with this 4th copy of the manual election returns. So in summary, this is how it actually works out. So the VCM, or the vote counting machine, will send 1 copy to the MBOC, or the Municipal Board of Canvassers, 1 copy to the central server, which also creates a copy to a backup server, and it also sends a copy to the transparency server. Now, since we have a ladderized election process, the results that are sent to the MBOC are the ones that are actually used to proclaim MBOC candidates. So at the municipal level, this includes mayor, vice mayor, and city councilors. After the municipalities are done, they send the results upwards towards what we call the PBOC, or the Provincial Board of Canvassers. And here we will proclaim positions such as governor, vice governor, and the provincial board. And once that's done, that's sent up to the national level, or the NBOC, where the higher positions such as president, vice president, senate, and the party list members are actually proclaimed, right? So it is a ladderized process where the MBOC will proclaim municipal candidates, the PBOC will proclaim provincial candidates, and the National Board of Canvassers will proclaim national candidates. At the same time, there is a contingency measure. So for example, if the VCM cannot transmit, there's a contingency measure where the election return is actually manually uploaded to the MBOC. So that is a backup mechanism in case that particular VCM in that clustered precinct could not transmit. And as mentioned a while ago, the VCM itself also prints out printed copies of the election returns, which goes to various parties, include citizens' arms, such as ourselves, and the major and minor political parties as well. And 1 copy is also posted in the area, right? So these are the printed copies, where Romel will explain next meeting what we do at the PPCRV headquarters to compare both the transparency results and the manually printed election return. Okay. And here we go. This is actually transmission. So what technologies are used for transmission? One is GSM technology will be the most common. This is the same technology you use in your cell phones, right? So whether it is Edge, GSM, 3G, 4G, right, is basically used to transmit the data. So mobile data is used. I think at the last election, up to 3G was used, right? And basically all ER data is encrypted. Last election, they used AES at 256-bit and SHA mechanism for the hardware machine access code at 256 bits as well. So this means this is a high degree of encryption, right? And of course, they will also try to ensure that there is good connectivity because majority of VCMs transmit using mobile data technology. Now, for certain locations that do not have cellular signal, there is an alternate transmission method of the VCMs called BGAN, right? So broadband general access network, which uses satellite technology instead. So these are for those locations that do not have mobile data connectivity. Now, for the municipal provincial board of canvassers, they also have the option to use something called VSAT, which is a more reliable satellite service as opposed to BGAN, which is more portable, right? So one is more reliable, one is more portable. And they can also use other mechanisms such as fiber and DSL if necessary for the municipal. But for the VCMs, it is generally mobile data or BGANs. Now, just because I have bars in the area, it doesn't mean I have mobile data. So bars simply mean I have some form of signal, but it could mean I can do calls and texts, but not necessarily, it doesn't necessarily mean that I have mobile data. And that's the reason why we tell our volunteers that on election day, you can use free services, for example, such as zero.facebook.com to check if you have mobile data in that particular area, right? So these are the mechanisms used to transmit our election returns. Now, of course, there are some considerations we must have in mind as well. So first off, there should be no signal jammers. That's the reason why there's a very strict rules and the COMELEC coordinates, for example, with the ANTC to make sure that these devices do not come in because these signal jammers, for example, can interfere with the transmission of data. The second one is basically interfering with the BEI or EB and the technician when they're trying to get a good signal. That's the picture on the right. Minsan mahina talaga yung signal, so kailangan talaga low o mabas, right? And third is, of course, there's no plugging transmission devices before transmission time. So during the election itself, no transmission device is plugged, right? So it's only the power that is plugged to the VCM machine. And the transmission device, which is either the GSM modem or the BGAN, the BGAN device, are only plugged during transmission, which is after printing of the 8 pre-transmission copies, right? Of course, the BEI/EBs and VCMs technicians must show steps. For example, if they have to use a backup VCM machine because there's a problem, they have to show the steps that they are taking in order to use the VCM machine. So the contingency procedure for replacement of machine, which Tito Henry mentioned last week, should be done in public view, right? So as poll watcher should be able to see them. And last but not the least, if transmission fails and there is really no way of data transmission, whether it is borrowing the GSM device of another clustered precinct or using BGANs, what generally happens is that the results are, the SD card is removed from the VCM machine, placed in an envelope marked as not transmitted, and it's sent up physically to the Municipal Board of Canvassers. So even though transmission does not occur, the results can still get to the Municipal Board of Canvassers and can still be canvassed. Okay. Now, what happens to the data that goes to the transparency server? Because this is the server where we actually get our data from at the PPCRV. So this is basically what it looks like. The VCM machines send all the data to the transparency server directly, right? Then from the transparency server, there are a number of recipients, right? So one of the recipients, of course, is the PPCRV. Our partners at the Kapisanan ng Broadcasters ng Pilipinas will also get a copy. The minority, the majority party and the minority party, this was during the last election, would also get copies. And the media entities present or who register for transparency server access with the COMELEC would also get access to the data. And these were the media entities present or who had data during the last election as well, right? So this was the 2019 recipient list, right? Of course, for the rest of us who do not have access directly to the transparency server, you can always access the data at a per precinct level at the COMELEC public access website. So nearer or during the election day, there is actually a public access website where you can get all the results from all the all the transmitted electronic returns that were transmitted to the central server. That is what is available in the COMELEC public access website. Okay, so before I move on, I'll just cover some frequently asked questions. Particularly, there were two questions here that were already covered last week, but I will visualize them as well. So there was a question last week on why are there a few missing election returns. So there are some cases where there are some election returns that were canvassed at the Municipal Board of Canvassers or National Board of Canvassers, but that particular precinct did not have a return at the transparency server. The reason for that is that the three transmissions to the central server, the MBOC, and the transparency server from the VCM are independent. So basically, it's a VCM sends to MBOC, VCM sends to central server, and VCM sends to transparency server. Now, when that happens, it is possible that the transmission to the MBOC succeeded, but the transmission to, say, the central server or the transparency server did not did not succeed, right? So there are cases like that, although they are few and in between, they do have happen, and that's the reason why there is a possibility that transmission does not are not the same for the three different servers. Okay, and also there is this manual contingency where the VCM manually you can actually get the data manually and load it to the MBOC in case transmission does not work at all. Now this one, the transparency server doesn't generally see, but it is part of the canvassing results, which is used in the municipality. And once the municipality is done, those results are also sent up to the province. Therefore, that precinct would be counted for that province and would be counted for the national tally. And that's the reason why, even though the transparency server shows a smaller number of precincts, it doesn't necessarily mean that the other precincts were not necessarily counted because of this contingency measure, which we don't see, we don't get the data for. Okay. There was also a question last meeting on fake VCMs. What if somebody bought a VCM and used a fake VCM? Now, there are some controls that are in place as well, including encryption, which has unique encryption keys and signing keys. There's also the signing keys that are used and stored in the iButtons. There's also a number of controls such as unique ballot IDs and the like. So all of this will basically ensure that that particular VCM is who it says it is. Now, at the same time, we have poll watchers as well. So we're allowed to have poll watchers in every clustered precinct, and the poll watchers can watch if that is a real VCM that actually transmitted. And if there was a fake VCM, I'm sure they won't invite poll watchers to watch the fake VCMs, right? So this is the controls that are in place to avoid getting results from fake VCMs. Of course, the encryption keys themselves are already quite a strong reason as well. Now, at the same time, the PPCRV performs what we call our unofficial parallel count, which is the vote validation activity, which Romel will explain next week. Right? There's also a common question on were security features used or disabled. So first off, the first security feature is barcode, right? And unique ballot ID. So each ballot has a unique barcode. Now, different ballots during the different elections have different forms of barcodes, and these barcodes are basically unique to a particular ballot. So you can't really interchange. So if the SD card for that particular precinct refers to precinct 1, and you use a ballot from precinct 2, it won't work, right? So there you have to use the ballot that was generally allocated for that particular precinct, right? At the same time, ballots only, and of course, ballots also have unique IDs themselves, so that you can't replay a ballot, like scan the ballot twice, for example. Ballots also only meet the machine. So the SD card and the ballots only meet on election day, right? So the ballots are printed at the National Printing Facility. They're shipped to the precincts. At the same time, the CF or SD cards, depending on which election, and the machines are sent to the precincts as well in separate routes, right? They only meet actually on final testing and sealing day, which is right before elections as well. Okay. What security features? There are also some other security features like the UV marks, right, which was used on all elections except in 2010, since the machine, the PCOS machine at the time was not configured to scan, to recognize that particular mark because a slightly different mark was used. We had to use physical UV lamps to validate the ballot. But for 2013, 2016, and 2019, the UV marks were present and they were scanned as part of the security features, but they were now scanned by the machine. That's why the human or the EB does not have to scan it themselves, and that's why there's no need for a physical UV lamp. At the same time, there's worm SD cards. So the SD card, the data is written on write-protected cards, which cannot be rewritten, right? So once the data is written, they cannot be rewritten. At the same time, the ballot images are also saved. So all of these things can be used after the election in case there are disputes. The fourth question and the last one, frequently asked question, is there's this question about queuing servers or queuing devices or data rooms, right? So I'll just give an analogy here. So this is what people think happens when you access a website. So you as the user, you have your browser here. You click on, for example, www.google.com, which is here, right? What people think happens is there is the internet in the middle. It's just one big internet. I connect to the internet, and that's why I can access Google, Facebook, and all of that. Reality is a little more complicated than that. So this is me, right? I access the internet, which is a combination of many things. There's a router at my home. There's a router in the internet itself. There are what we call DNS servers. At the same time, the ISP itself will have certain equipment. They will have routers, firewalls, and other pieces of equipment. And once it gets to the service provider, say Google, right, there are other devices as well, such as load balancers and routing equipment. This is the same thing that this is the same, a similar setup also occurs when we are using an automated election system. It's not just one big internet or mobile data in that particular case. There are network devices and pieces of equipment as well that route the traffic, and they use protocols as well, such as DNS. So there are many, many more components that comprise the actual transmission as opposed to just the transmission media, which is either mobile data or satellite via BGAN or VSAT. Okay, so I think that's it for my presentation. And I hope you found it meaningful, and I would open the floor to questions. Back to you, Kimi.
Oh, okay, Tito Ayu. I think that was an extremely good presentation, no? Especially for me, especially as a communication technologies management student. It's really nice to see how our technological landscape has molded, especially during our elections. So we have questions on our chat box and also on Facebook that I'll be reading to you shortly. But first, just like the first time, I'd like to ask my own questions, Tito Wayu. So my question is, it seems that transmission of votes relies a lot on getting good signal po. So what if there are other external factors, no, such as strong rain or strong wind or generally unreliable signal? Like, wouldn't that interfere with the VCM machines communicating with parang different servers po?
Yeah, that's a very good question, Kimi. And that's actually a question that the service providers, including the COMELEC, have to think about during election day. Because the election day window for transmitting data is from closing up to you're able to transmit. And of course, the sooner you transmit, the better. So do we have infinitely reliable internet connectivity? Probably not, right? We can't expect it to be reliable all the time. And that is the reason why there are contingency measures. So first off, each VCM will normally have a backup measure, right? So either there will be two SIM cards, right? One provider and another provider, just in case one provider has bad signal, hopefully the other provider has better signal. right? Or there is, in some locations, if there is only one provider, like there's only one telco in that particular island province, for example,
Mhm.
then they would have a contingency BGAN in that area. The BGANs are the satellite devices I showed a while ago, which can basically be distributed to certain voting centers. So usually they can provision, because a part of the planning for the transmission is the transmission vendor will have to survey those particular locations. So if they feel that, okay, this location has two telcos, okay, let's put two SIM cards here. This location has no telco, let's put a beacon, let's put a VSAT. This location has a telco but only one, okay, let's put a SIM card there, but let's also put a beacon as a backup. So those are all the extremely reliable transmission mechanisms. Now, there is always a fallback mechanism. If all of that fails, right? What the EB would do would take the 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 main SD card, will put it in an envelope, will mark it as not transmitted, and will physically bring it to the municipal board of canvassers. So if all else fails, you can still use horse, boat, jeepney, tricycle to bring the result up, right? So I hope I answered the question.
Okay, yes, you did. That was it's really nice, no, to see that there are always backup plans. So we actually have a question from one of our Zoom attendees. So this is from John on Zoom. Some people I've met here have concerns about election integrity coming from the 7-hour late release of the 2019 results. No? So what are your response to these concerns, Po?
Yeah, so thanks for the question, John. Right. So the 7 hour delay is actually not a delay in transmission. So if you notice my chart a while ago, so I believe I showed it a while ago, you would see the transmission for 2019 was actually received on time. So you notice there's no 7 hour glitch here. So what this means is that the transparency server itself actually got the results from the VCM at the appropriate time they were supposed to get it. The problem was, in order for us, the PPCRV, the KBP, and all of the parties that are waiting at the transparency server to get the results, this is where the problem occurs. So this part, VCM to transparency server, was fine. It is the transparency server down to us that actually got delayed by 7 hours. Now, of course, we were quite concerned about it as well. And we worked with the various parties in the transparency server room to make sure that we were able to audit that particular process. So what happens is when the data did come in, which is about 1 a.m. The following day, when the data finally got out of the transparency server, we also did an audit ourselves, right? We also checked the results of the transparency server to make sure the timestamp wise, the VCMs were able to transmit the results and the transparency server got the results at that time. We also cross-correlated the results with the results obtained from another server, which is the central server. So we use the data from the Comelec public access website to reconcile with the data of the transparency server to ensure that the data did arrive at that particular time. Yes, we do understand it was concerning kasi syempre for most of us, we are dependent on the transparency server data and it took 7 hours, so medyo nakakakabayan. Especially if we're so used to the previous elections na medyo mabilis lumabas yung results. But we were able to do the audit itself, and we have made some recommendations to the COMELEC as well to ensure that it does not happen again in the future. Okay, so I hope I answered that question.
Okay, so our next question is from Demario Rivera from Zoom. They ask, are the VVPATs counted at all, po? Or the VVPATS, are they counted at all? Can it be used as a counter check to VCM generated EERs, po?
Yes, so that is actually another good question. And we have been talking about that actually. So we are now in the process of redesigning what we call the random manual audit. So there is a process in the election where a certain random number of clustered precincts and VCMs are basically chosen, where we would open the machines and we would physically count the ballots. There is some internal discussion as well that we can actually take the VVPATs also and count them as well. So it is an additional like quality assurance mechanism. So quick answer, in the previous election, no, we did not count the VVPATs, right? But in future elections, there is some ongoing discussion on possibly using the VVPAT as an additional audit mechanism. Okay.
Okay, so our next question is from somebody called SJS po on Zoom. I think you kind of answered this, but to reiterate the question, what can you do if you can't send the electoral returns? Like when even the teachers try to call to ask for instructions on what to do po.
Yeah, so that's where the contingency measures come in. Now, every election will have slightly different contingency measures. Like the most basic contingency measure is to use the SIM card that was allocated to you with the modem. If that doesn't work, you use another modem or the BGAN. But for different locations, the contingency will be slightly different, right? But at the end of the day, yung pinaka fallback is manually bring the SD card to the Municipal Board of Canvassers. So yun yung pinaka pinaka-dulong contingency measure. Now, there are some other contingency measures din kasi minsan we're not sure if the transmission is because the transmission device did not work. Minsan it might be the VCM. So there are some mechanisms when you call the call center, sometimes they may ask you to try a different VCM machine, right, to transmit. So there are measures like that. But that one will depend on a case-to-case basis. And the EBs are supposed to call the support line. The support line will give you guidance on which contingency measure to use. And if all else fails, yun nga, may kabayo, may tricycle, may bangka, to bring to manually bring the SD card to the Municipal Board of Canvassers.
Okay. So our next question is it possible that the VCMs could be instructed from remote central servers to generate, transmit, and print manipulated ERs?
Right. So that's a very conspiracy filled question. So I'll try to answer it as best as I can. So first off, the software that's being used in the machine undergoes something called a source code review, right? So this is done by a third party called an International Certification Authority, and it's also done by volunteers, right? And the source code review process for the last election was open to many volunteers, right, including ourselves at the PPCRV. There were some other groups as well, including NAMFREL and the political parties. Now, the source code review is the COMELEC would invite a broad range of people. Now, not all people have the capability to review source code, right? So in this particular case, the party sent representatives, we sent representatives. Now, the source code is reviewed. So if there is code there that says, please generate some fake results and send it, then we should be able to see it. So that's one, right? That's one check. The second check is what we call final testing and sealing. So the final testing sealing is the day before election or a few days before election when the machine arrives. The EBs at that particular clustered precinct will do a check on the machines, right? They will put 5 ballots, they'll give it to the volunteers in the area, and they'll do a test transmission. The idea there is to check if the machine is really counting the proper 5 ballots. They will open the machine and check, did the 5 people who voted 5 times, are the results the same as the results that the machine counted? So that's the second check. Diba? Kasi if the software was tampered to transfer votes from one person to another, de mahuhuli na rin yan sa final testing and sealing. Right? So that's the second thing. The third thing is during the RMA. So after election, once elections are closed, a random number of precincts are chosen. Usually 1 per congressional district. So usually 1 up to 3 per congressional district, depending on the size of the congressional district, are selected at random. And what happens is the machines are open, right? The ballots are counted and it's compared with the electronically transmitted results. They should match, right? So that is the third audit mechanism. And the fourth, the pinaka-fourth and the last audit mechanism is what we do here at PPCRV, which Romel will explain next week, which is what we call the parallel count. So those are the 4 mechanisms to ensure that there's no fake machine or there's no machine that was told to generate. Because if one of those things were done, then one of the 4 mechanisms should be able to catch it. Right? So I hope I answered the question.
Okay. So our last question is from Gary Ramirez. What will be the final basis or bases of the final count of the election result? Is it from the central server or transparency server po?
Neither. right? So the answer is
Mm.
neither, right? So it's not the transparency server for sure, because that is just for us, right? For transparency. It's also not for the central server. It's not the central server because although the central server is called central server, it really is a backup server and it's used for the public results. It is the results that you get in the MBOC, PBOC, and NBOC that is the basis for the proclamation. So if we're talking about mayors, dapat MBOC ng City of Cebu, for example, will be the one to proclaim the mayor. So that is the electronically received result by the Cebu City BOC, right? If it's the province of Cebu, for example, it should be the Cebu Provincial Board of Canvassers. There's a machine there also that gets its results from the various municipalities and cities within Cebu, right? Goes to the Cebu PBOC, and that is used to proclaim governor. Then the results are sent up to what we call the NNBOC, which is used naman for national position. So the correct answer is it depends, right? So if it's mayor ng Cebu City, dapat yung MBOC, yung CCS machine is what they call it, consolidating and canvassing server of the MBOC in Cebu City, which is used to proclaim the position of mayor of Cebu. So it varies. So maraming server yan. All right. Hope I
Okay,
answered the
so
question.
I'm sure you did, sir. So unfortunately, that's all the time we have to answer questions. Now I'm looking at the Zoom chat. There are many, many more questions that need to be asked. But no worries, just continue following us on Facebook and Twitter. And again, we will get back to you with the answers. So before we close, to give us more words of inspiration and to push us again, this week, let us welcome the amazing Vice Chairman of PPCRV, Mr. Johnny Cardenas.
I think we have to unmute him. Ayun.
Hello po.
Hello, good afternoon.
Yes, we can hear you po.
Yeah, magandang hapon po sa inyo lahat. Napakaganda naman pala at safe ang boto natin. Base yan sa paliwanag ng ating kasamang si Doc William. At napakaliwanag ang kanyang mga sinabi sa atin ngayong hapon. At sana yung mga agam-agam ng iba pa nating mga kasamahan na nag-iisip-isip pa dahil may duda sa sistema at baka raw nadadaya, sayang lang. Kung kaya't napakahalaga po itong ginagawa nating talakayan mula nung Sabado pa. Nag-umpisa kay Brother Henry at ngayon kay Doc William. Kung kaya't panawagan po natin sa mga iba pa na nagdududa dyan, maganda sanang yung hindi pa nakakapakinig at nakakasali dito sa talakayan tuwing Sabado, sumama at maintindihan yung sistema. Ang sabi nga nila dyan ay good to know, hindi ba? So, sa mga hindi pa nagpaparehistro, abay, huwag na kayong maghintay pa ng deadline. Habang maaga tayo, habang maaga pa, tayo'y pumunta na sa COMELEC at magpa-register para sa halalan 2022. Sa susunod na Sabado po ay inaanyayahan namin kayo muli na samahan kami sa ganitong talakayan upang mapalawak pa ang ating kalaman sa proseso ng halalan. So with that, good afternoon to all. Magandang hapon po sa inyong lahat. Salamat po.
Salamat, Brother Johnny.
Sige. Thank you po, Tito Johnny. So thank you so much po. And thank you so much po, Tito Yu. And to everyone, before we end again, there's a survey that will flash on your screens after our webinar and we'll put up in our comment section on Facebook. Kindly please accomplish. And once again, thank you very much. I hope it's been a truly good afternoon to all of you. See you next Saturday for our very last session, part 3 of our It's Good to Know webinar series. We'll have Mr. Romel Bernardo to answer the question, how does PPCRV do parallel counting? So once again, I'm Kimi Antonio, encouraging all of you to register to vote. And again, see you all next week. Goodbye.